Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Let's continue with the third part of repetition structures. Previously in this topic, we have looked at while loop and do while loop in terms of the syntax and examples on how they can be used. In while loop, we would write it as while and then the expressions. If the expression becomes true, it will execute all the statements. In do while loop, we would write do statements and then only it will check the condition of it. So that means that in do while loop, regardless whether it's true or false, all the statements will be executed first. It will then decide whether to repeat the statements if the conditions is true. In this part, we will learn about for loop. The syntax is for, initial statement, semicolon, loop condition, semicolon, update statement. And then it will do all the statements that we want. For example, system.out.print or any calculation. Each of the parts is separated by semicolon. It will give an error if you use a comma instead of semicolon within your for. The way that for loop executes is it first executes the initial statement. Then the loop condition is evaluated. If the loop condition evaluates to true, it will execute the for loop statement that is within the for loop. Then it will execute the update statement, the third expression in the parenthesis. The same steps are repeated until the loop condition evaluates to false. Here, as for loop, there are three parts in the syntax, which are the initial statement, loop condition, and the update statement. When we write our while or do while loop, we would do our initialization, the condition, and also the update statement, such as increment, where we wrote those within or before our while and do while loop. In for loop, we write it within the syntax straight away. We will look at codes to make sense of this in the next few slides. For loop can be represented in flowchart as shown here. The three parts in the for loop can be represented as initial statement, for example an input, then checking the condition in Diamondship. So if the condition is true, it will execute the statements and then update the statement, such as increment the value. It will then repeat the process of checking the condition again until it becomes false and exits the for loop. Similar as before, statements can be any input, output, or process, and the shapes used would depend on the type. Let's look at this simple example. Here we have for, then the initial statement is I equal to 1, the condition is I less than 5, and the update statement is increment of I, which is I++. Remember to write the semicolon in between the parts within the for statement. Similar to what we have seen in if else, while, and do while loop, when we only have one statement, for example here we have system.out.print and printing out the value of I, we don't need to use braces. What do you think happens within this code? Let's go through it step by step. In the first round, the value of I is 1. Is I less than 5? So since the condition is true, because 1 is less than 5, it will execute the statement system.out.print and display the value of I, which is 1. Only after that, it will do the increment of I by 1. So I will become 2. It then checks the condition. Is 2 less than 5? That is true. So the statement is executed and the output is the value of 2. It then increment I by 1, so I becomes 3. The same steps are repeated. 3 is less than 5, and because that is true, the output now will display the value 3, and then it will do the increment, so I becomes 4. In the next round, when I is 4, the condition is also true. It will print out the value 4, and then it will do the increment, so I becomes 5. When it checks 5 less than 5, the condition is false, so it exits the for loop. The final output from this code is 1, 2, 3, 4. The more complete code of this is we declared I before we use it within the for loop, so we would write int I. Let's look at this example. Can we declare and use our variable I within the for loop? So what if we write it as for int I equal to 1? Do you think that this is valid? Yes, this is valid. Can you tell me what is the difference of declaring it before the for loop and declaring it within the for statement? If we declare int I within the for loop, variable I cannot be accessed outside of the for loop. For example, if we have system.out.println I is, which is the last println statement, it will give us an error saying that it cannot find the variable I. However, if we declared int I before the for loop or anywhere else in the class before we use it within the for loop, we can access it throughout the class. For example, in this code, when we have the last system.out.println, it will display the value 5 because after the increment from within the for loop, I has the value of 5. So what is the advantage of declaring the variables within the for loop or before the for loop? It all depends whether you want the variable to be accessible outside of the for loop or maybe if you want to reuse the variable. This means you can always reassign new values to it without having to declare several variables. You might want to declare and use the variable only within the for loop in your program. Think of it as temporary variables where you do not want it to be accessed anywhere else within the class. Going back to the initial code of this example, how can we change it to while loop and do while loop? As for loop contains the three parts within the for statement, in while and do while, those parts need to be written separately. In while loop, for the same code, it can be written as I equal to 1, which is initializing the variable, then the condition is within the while, I less than 5. If the condition is true, it will execute the print statement, then increment the value of 1. Similarly, in do while loop, we need to initialize I to 1. Then the statement within the do increment by 1, then checking the condition. Based on this comparison of for loop, while loop, and do while loop, we can see that in for loop, we can make the code more compact as it only requires 2 lines of code to do the same as the for or 5 lines of while and do while loop. However, all of this give the same result, so it depends on which type of looping you prefer to use. Let's look at another example. Here we have 2 statements within the for loop, so we need to use the braces. We have I equal to 1, the condition is I less than 3, then we will increment it by 1, so we have I++. Let's go through it step by step again. As I is equal to 1, 1 is less than 3, so that is true. It will execute both of the statements. It will display Yahoo, a space, then on the same line, 3 stars. I is then incremented by 1, so I becomes 2. In the second round, I is equal to 2. 2 is less than 3, so that is true. It will display another Yahoo, space, and then the 3 stars. I now becomes 3. When it checks the condition, 3 is not less than 3, so it becomes false and exits the loop. Another example that we have here is to show what happens when we do not use braces but have 2 statements. Similar to what we know about if, else, and also while loop, when we do not have braces, only the first statement belongs to the loop. The second statement is outside of the loop. In this code, when we do for I equal to 1, I less than or equal to 5, I++, it will loop and display the word Yahoo 5 times. When I is less or equal to 5 becomes false, then only it will execute and display the last print statement and print the 3 stars. When we use any repetition statements, we need to make sure that the loop will eventually terminate. Otherwise, we will get an infinite loop where it continues to execute endlessly. Let's look at this code. Here we have a while loop that will execute the statement if the value of product is less than 5,000. Within the while loop, it will do product equal to product times 5. Is there anything wrong with this code? This while loop is an infinite loop because the statement product equal to product times 5 will always have the value 0. So the condition that product is less than 5,000 will never become false. So we need to be careful when writing the condition for our loop. To summarize, in this part, we have learned about for loop in terms of the syntax, and we have looked at examples on how we can use for loop.